So here we go. Give me a minute. Okay. A really warm welcome to all of you who are listening to us tonight. We at Odetta run a series of fireside chats with inspiring women, women who have a story, and stories we can learn a lot from. Today, we have such a guest who has joined us from the United States to help people get into grad schools in the United States, especially for people who live in the Middle Eastern and the South Asian region. Our guest is Yasmin, who is currently a product manager at Pinterest. Previously, Yasmin has worked as a ads and shopping lead on the business operation teams at Pinterest. She joined Pinterest after graduating from Stanford, and before that, she has worked as a vice president at Citadel Capital. She is a proud Egyptian, an avid cook and baker, and she loves to identify herself as a helicopter dog mom whom I wish to see during our session as well. So, my special request to all of you guys is to keep posting your questions in the comment section to make it interactive with our special guest. So, thank you so much, Yasmin, for giving us a shot at doing this.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so Yasmin, I am a cat mom. I think I told you this before, but I want to know more about how it feels to be a dog mom and what's her name.
So my dog her name is Mila. She actually just turned 2 a couple of days ago. It's it's like having a little kid. I don't have kids, so I tell myself that it's like having kids, minus the back talk. It's a lot. It's really. I think it's how difficult you decide to make it for yourself. So I overwhelm myself a little bit with care for my dog. But yeah, she's great. She's giving me a little attitude right now because I just went on a little trip and left her for a week. So she's very sad.
Yeah, they take a lot of time to get back to their normal state when you leave them for a while.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Yasmin, I'm going to use this opportunity to get to know your journey, especially your educational journey more. And that's how I'm going to start it off. What was your key motivator to study abroad? And what are some best learnings you've had from that experience?
Yeah. So I sort of grew up abroad, quote unquote. So I kind of like grew up all over. So I was born in Egypt, as you mentioned. And my family shortly thereafter moved to Dubai, which tends to happen for some people who grew up on our side of the world. My parents moved for work. So my older brother and I went to like elementary and middle school in Dubai. So I sort of had that like small experience of studying kind of abroad, but with my family unit there. And I think that was the first seed that was planted of this opportunity that like you could go to college abroad because that sort of was very much the expectation for kids that studied in the school that I went to. That like eventually, once you graduated high school, that you tend to travel abroad for school. I actually ended up not traveling for undergrad. I went to undergrad in Cairo. I stayed at home for undergrad. But during my undergrad years, I decided to apply for an exchange program. So that was my first sort of like venture away from my family. I came to the US. That was the first time I had ever been to the US. It was in 2007. And I studied for a year abroad in Seattle. And I just absolutely fell in love with it. It was really hard. It was the first time I had lived completely far away from my family, and I probably chose like the furthest point on the globe away from them, not intentionally, but it was just kind of like the matching that happened. And it was a great experience. The preview of what it was like to study abroad and like what U.S. learning looked like was very, very different from what I was accustomed to back home, and I really appreciated it. And so I think that sort of made me want to do more of that. I did have to go back to graduate in Egypt, and so eventually I always had this hope of going back for grad school. That didn't happen immediately. So I ended up graduating undergrad. I ended up getting a job and then getting hit by the financial crisis, but then also the Arab Spring, and I graduated with a finance degree. So it was kind of like a hard decision to. There never seemed to be the right moment for me to be like, this is the best time for me to go to grad school, and so I always put that decision off. And so it took me quite a bit of time to make the decision to go to grad school. And then I eventually did quite a bit after. So I think typically people go to business school, which is what I decided to do, like 4 years ish after graduating undergrad. I went closer to 7 or 8, so slightly later. And what I had told myself was, if I don't do it this year, I'm probably not doing it. And it was just like, it seemed like the right moment. The things that I was working on at work kind of were like tailing off. I had been at the firm that I was at for 6 years. So it seemed like the right moment for me. And I wasn't really sure what I was going to do next. And so it just felt like everything had lined up for me to try to go at that time. And I was lucky enough to be able to do so. And so that's why I ended up traveling.
So I have like a lot of questions in the introduction that you've just given us. So first of all, like why finance? Why did you like choose finance? And then after your experience, what changed or maybe what led you to do like choose a business school?
Why finance is a hard question, because you're not going to love my answer. It wasn't intentional. I actually studied science in school. So I actually wanted to be a doctor growing up. And needless to say, I did not become one. But I always wanted to become a surgeon. My family did not want me to become one, mostly because they thought it was a ton of work and really hard. And the way medical programs work, at least in Egypt, unlike the US, is that you sort of sign up for the 8 years. Like, it's not you sign up for pre-med and then you make a choice to go to grad school for medical school. It's you sign up for 8 years of your life at the age of, I was starting undergrad at the age of 16, and you make that decision at the age of 16, which my mom was very concerned that I would, sign up for the next 8 years of my life. And once you start, you're kind of like locked in. So my parents lobbied really aggressively against me going to medical school. My uncle was also a doctor. He is a doctor, and they basically used him as like the poster example of like, this is your life if you decided to become a doctor, and it's hard. So my parents were both bankers, and so they were like, look at finance. It's this great 4-year program, half the time. And so they advocated for that. And I was going to school at a time where finance was like, it's today's tech, right? Like at that time, finance jobs were all the rage, and everyone was going to Wall Street. And so, funnily enough, I graduated right when that whole world kind of came to a screeching halt. But so that was kind of the reason. I never like was absolutely in love with it, but I was really good with numbers. I was very good at math. Not that you need to be good at math with finance, but it seemed fine. And I was just like, all right, I guess I'll try this. And then I kind of did. I kind of stumbled into it. I never intentionally decided to do it. I will say that I eventually found my way in finance. I started off doing equity research at Goldman Sachs, which was interesting, but I didn't fall in love with. And then I eventually made my way to private equity, which I absolutely fell in love with, specifically because I did investing in Africa. And my love for that didn't stem from the like financial aspect of my job. Like as much as I like spent probably the majority of my time staring at Excel sheets, that wasn't really the joy. The fun part for me was honestly like getting to walk through. We invested in like industrial plants essentially, or infrastructure projects, and getting to like actually physically walk through those projects and see the construction go from like quite literally an empty piece of land to like a monstrous sized plant that employs a ton of people in your country or in other African countries was really a wonderful thing to be able to see and say that, I had like one tiny, tiny part to play in that. So that was really rewarding and probably the thing that kept me there. And it was intellectually stimulating to like figure out. So I sort of like found the thing that worked for me in the end within finance.
So after
Yeah,
you
what's your
found that
question?
love, how did you find that point that you wanted to still graduate, like get into a graduate school again? I think it's for us, like I'm just gonna post out a question very properly. Like when we get into our careers, we are like we just get used to getting that money, right? So it's all about like, okay, you're just doing everything, you're independent now, so why going into that educational phase again and doing those academic research just even fascinated you, and how and why was it the right choice?
Yeah. I agree. I think it's really hard to make a choice to go back to school, especially since so an MBA, unlike most other master's degrees, is intentionally a program that you do a couple of years after you work. So a lot of master's degrees you can tack on to your undergrad, so it's before you even go back to the workforce or enter the workforce, I should say. So an MBA, you actually have to make a very intentional decision to say, I'm going to stop working and go back to school, which is a difficult transition to make. One, just like you haven't been studying for a while and you sort of like put yourself back into a learning environment, which is harder. The income hit is harder. They're more expensive than any other master's degree program, as far as I know, at least. So all of that is like a tough pill to swallow. But I think they do that intentionally so that you're really going for those types of degrees for the right reasons and not going just to get sort of like a stamp on your resume, because they are really hard to get into, and like doing all that work and spending all of that time and money, really like you ought to be doing it for the right reasons. And so it's sort of like stacked and built intentionally for that reason. The reason I chose to leave my job and go to school was I started seeing diminishing returns in the learning that I was getting from the deals I was working on. I had learned so much at this job. Like I cannot explain the amount of exposure. The people that I worked with were incredibly like generous with their time, and also just like the things that they taught me. It was quite a small firm, and the size of the deals that we got to work on were quite large, and so I got probably a disproportionate amount of exposure to my seniority than I probably would have gotten elsewhere. And over time, I think that curve was leveling off in terms
Mhm.
of what I was gaining in return for the time and energy I was investing into my job. So I was still learning, but it had sort of become comfortable, right? And so I had not yet. I was still in my 20s. Like I had not. I wasn't gonna coast for the rest of my life, and I was still wanting to learn more, and I was still wanting to figure out what I was going to do. So that was one thing. Like I felt like I still needed to learn a lot more like a lot more, and I wasn't sure that I was going to get that by just continuing to work on more and more deals. The other thing was I wasn't sure that that was the job that I was going to have for the rest of my life, right? Like private equity was great and amazing. It's a lot of work. Like you work a ton, and I wasn't sure that, to my earlier point, like I kind of stumbled into finance. Like it wasn't an intentional decision to pursue that degree or that industry. And sure, I had found this job that was interesting enough, but was I really going to spend the next 30 years of my life in this job just for that reason? And so I wanted to take this like step back to say, okay, is this actually the job that I'm going to spend the rest of my life doing? Because I had just spent the last 6 years of my life doing it, but I plan to work well into my life. So like I just wanted that opportunity. And so an MBA gives you that option to like actually stop and reflect on what are the opportunities for you. It gives you the opportunity to pivot if so you choose, which is what I ended up doing. and it exposes you to a whole variety of options and people and industries and roles that you may be completely unaware of. And so I wanted to give myself that option. And even if I came out of an MBA saying, actually, you know what, finance is great and I'm going to go back to private equity, that was totally fine. But I just wanted to make sure I went through the exercise of reflecting on that decision before I sort of went deeper down that path.
So now you had your mind made up that you wanted to get into graduate school. Why US? Like, did that exchange program still leave like something, some yearning for you to go back, or was there like a proper another kind of tangent going on that led you there?
Um, I think it was a variety of things. So I think I went to American schools my entire life, so I was very comfortable with US based learning like models. I had some friends who went to British schools, and I know that the way that they teach is really different. And so I was optimizing for like a model that I understood, or that I
Mhm.
knew that I could thrive in, because I knew that like moving myself, like first of all, like quitting my job, signing up for a program, whether a year or two, the financial burden, but also the relocation was all like a burden that I would have to sort of bear, and I didn't want to make it even harder by like putting myself through an academic program that was going to be sort of something that was I was completely unaccustomed to, right? So like I needed some semblance of something I was familiar with. So that was one part of it. The other part of it was I was also pursuing an MBA degree, and typically the highest ranking MBA programs tend to be US based schools.
Yep.
And so I also had told myself something very intentional, which was an MBA program is a very expensive degree. And so I had told myself that I made a list of the schools that I would um, give up my job for. And so I wasn't like, I'm not just going to go for any random place. And I had told myself, these are the schools that I think are worth my time and my energy and my money. Um, and if I can get into one of these, then I will do this. And if not, then I won't. And I only applied to those schools. So I know some people do the whole like cast your net wide and apply to a bunch of safety schools, and that's totally fine if your goal and what you're optimizing for is something else. But for me personally, that wasn't what I was doing, and the opportunity cost of this job that I was giving up was pretty high, and so I wanted to make sure that I was doing, I was doing it for something that was equally as valuable. So I was very intentional about that, and so it just so happened that all of those schools sat in the U.S. One of them was in the UK, and then I
Mhm.
just ended up choosing to go to a US school.
So when you moved to US, what were your feelings like? How did you overcome them? Because like initially you knew you could go back, but when you go with the mindset that you're gonna do your grad school, you intend to do the job as well, at least how most of the people think. So how did you cope up with all of the relocation part? Trying to fit in, fit out, stand out. I don't know. Like, how did you approach it?
I don't think I was trying to stand out at all, honestly. um, it's so hard because I don't think it happens so fast. Like when you get there, they do such a wonderful job of like greeting students, and they try actually to do even more for international students, and they try to do even more for students who are traveling with their families. um,
Mhm.
so I will say that at least school I went to, they really try hard to like make it as welcoming as possible. But I think the amount of things that get thrown at you right when you get on campus make it such that you honestly just have no time to even register how you're feeling. So I don't think I even realized like how tired or stressed or worried I was until like well into my first quarter. Because I was still like, I was like, oh my God, I have to make friends, and I have to like suddenly go to these classes and it's case-based learning, and suddenly everyone was reading 20 cases a night somehow. And it's just like, how are people even doing this? And I realized that in the end, they weren't actually reading the 20 cases, but that's a myth that you discover later on. But you just sort of, and it's also interesting because when you go to these programs, so like typically, I'm trying to think of like the best way to frame this. When I was in school as a kid, like I was a nerd, understandably, right? Like I studied really hard. I'm pretty confident about like being able to like study really hard. But when you go to these programs, you're kind of like surrounded by only really intelligent people, right? And so it's actually very daunting, because suddenly the average is that everyone's highly intelligent, and so it just makes you question yourself a lot. And I think that was my biggest concern. That was my biggest sort of adjustment that I had to make in my mind, that like my normal effort level wasn't going to sort of cut it in this program.
Mhm.
Not to say that I had to like work harder than I've ever had to work ever before, but I just had to like sit with that and just be like, I'm surrounded by 400 highly intelligent human beings. And that's okay. And that's amazing and an opportunity. And I can learn so much from them. And it's not actually a competition. And the program is actually structured such that you're not actually necessarily competing with your peers, and you're supposed to actually learn from them. And that's the whole premise behind case-based learning. Um, but like when I went to school as a kid, it was all about like who gets the highest grade, right? And so you have to
Yeah.
actually shift your mind about how you view learning. Um, so there was a lot of adjusting in there. Um, I didn't have a ton of issues with like settling in. Again, I moved completely on my own. I know people who moved with their families. Um, they had a much harder time. Again, the school does so much work to help you settle in with like housing and schooling if you have kids with you. But it's hard. Like if you're moving your significant other and if you're moving children, that can't be easy, no matter like how much work a school does for you.
Yeah.
Um, and so that all takes a lot of time. And then layer on trying to build a social network and like meeting people, and then layer on the fact that you have to sit in classes all day, and like they're very unforgiving with like with missing class. Like you can't just not go. You have to physically be in class and be present and be prepared and like participate. Um, so it's a lot. And so in the beginning, you're just kind of, you feel like you're struggling, but eventually you find your groove. And I feel like the point at which I felt pretty confident was in my second year when I saw the new class come in, and you can kind of see like the deer in the head, like the headlights, like vision in their eyes. And I'm just like, oh, like it'll be okay. And I'm just like, you'll survive. It's okay. It's really overwhelming. And even for people who like live in the US who just like moved from one state to the next, it's still overwhelming for them. Like everyone had to quit a job, pack up their life, and move. And and they don't know anyone, right? Like so it's hard for everyone.
So, from that different way of learning to different, like, what is the best thing that you learned while you were doing all of those classes? You were learning with groups. What is one thing that really worked out for you that you would like at least suggest to other people to start doing it, even irrespective of where they are?
Oh wow. That would be really hard to distill a 2-year degree. I will say the biggest thing I invested time in honing in my 2 years is soft skills, which I think are highly underweighted in traditional learning. So the schools I went to overweighted on math and science, right? And they teach you
Mhm.
like hard skills that you can use in whatever job that you need, which is understandable. And in the program that I went to, in your second year at least, you have the opportunity to choose your electives, which most MBA programs afford you the choice of, and it's sort of a choose your own adventure, and you can do whatever you want depending on what you're sort of optimizing for. And because of my background, I wasn't really trying to go and find, you know, like finance classes or marketing classes or anything like that, because I had already done finance, or I had a business undergrad degree, so I had done that sort of at a very high level. Um, and so I was just like, oh, I'm gonna take a lot of these soft skill classes. And so
Mhm.
Stanford is infamous, not infamous actually, very famous for this, wrong word. But they have this class called interpersonal dynamics that a lot of people talk about. But they actually have a lot of other classes, like managing difficult conversations. And I mean, I can run you through a very long list of them. But it had never actually occurred to me that you could sit in a classroom and teach something like that. And I will say that that has by far been the toolkit that I have been using in my job the most since I've graduated. It has guided my conversations with my manager and my management chain at work. I work in product right now, and the interesting thing about product management jobs are that no one actually reports to you. You sort of have to influence all these people to do things without having any sort of actual reporting relationship with them. And so leading by influence is a really important part of my job, which I don't think I would have been able to do successfully had I not taken all of those classes. And so really developing soft skills has probably been by far the biggest and most important takeaway that I've had from that program.
Out of all the soft skills that a person can learn, what is again, like I'm really interested in knowing this because I know how our undergrad schools at least do not teach us how to present ourselves, how to brand ourselves, how to like even interact at even offices or corporates or startups, etc. So what would be that one thing that you thought was very different, and if you had that information or maybe that knowledge or that skill when you were working at Citadel, that would have worked out very differently than it did right now at Pinterest?
Let me make sure I understand your question. You're saying what soft skill had I had before would have changed my career trajectory? Is that the question?
Maybe the career trajectory, or maybe you think that maybe it would have been more fun, or maybe you would have loved it even more, or there are some things that you reflect on after gaining a new skill. You think that maybe you would have used it in XYZ positions, and maybe if you wouldn't have had a chance to come to a grad school, and if you would have had that knowledge in your undergrad school, that would have been the best thing that you could have learned. That is something that all of us can focus on, maybe.
I would say if you can learn to negotiate well, it will change your life. I took a class that's pretty famous that was taught, and I don't think she teaches it anymore. It was taught by Maggie Neal at Stanford. It's called, it was a negotiation class. I forget what the name of the class was, but she wrote a book about it. And the book is quite literally verbatim like her class. So you can easily purchase the book. But one of our assignments was that we had to go into a store and negotiate a product down that isn't actually negotiable. So besides the fact that that's like really nerve wracking and super fun, I think it teaches you a lesson that like everything is negotiable. And so my biggest takeaway from that class has been that I just don't take no for an answer now. Whereas when like the younger version of myself, especially when I worked at Citadel, if someone just said no to something, I'd just be like, oh, okay. And that would have been just my immediate reaction. Um, but I was trying to launch a product at Pinterest more recently, and I cannot tell you the number of people that said no to me just because it was really hard. There were a lot of like privacy considerations, and it was very complicated. And it took us a year to build it because it was really complex. But I think I attribute actually a lot of the credit to that skill that I negotiated like I've never negotiated before. And I don't think I could have had I not taken that class.
Thank you so much for that insight. I will personally look into that book and maybe ping you one day. Hey, Yasmin, thank you so much for guiding me at that point of time.
Yeah.
Uh, so more about how and like how to get into a graduate school. What is the best stage to think about moving to US? Basically, if you were like, as you just mentioned, that all the like, ironically, I don't know, or maybe like coincidentally, all the best universities are there. So, what would be a really good time for people in the Metro region to start thinking about a graduate or the postgraduate degree?
I will say most of the best MBA programs are in the US. There are some really great ones in Europe as well. But not all the best master's programs are only in the US. Depending on what you're trying to do for grad school, there are obviously a lot of schools all around the world. So I would say um, focus on like obviously depending on like what degree you're trying to pursue. It will vary what geography you go to. Um, but to your question on when is the right time, again, I think it depends on the degree. I know a lot of people, for example, who pursue computer science degrees do that immediately right after undergrad. Like it's the most logical thing. It doesn't require work experience to do, and I think there's some like optimization that you get from like tacking it on to your undergrad degree that saves you some time. So if you can do those types of optimizations to like save yourself time in your career, then you should absolutely do that. If you're specifically talking about an MBA program, there are obviously programs that are there are things called like 2+2 where you apply when you're in undergrad and you sort of like defer for 2 years and then you come back. So some people pursue that option. I didn't do that, obviously, but some people like to know that that's what they're going to be doing in 2 years. I would say it's really hard to have like a plan. I reject the notion of a 5-year plan because I think it um I think it forces you to or it like prevents you from being open to the opportunities at hand. So if I had had a 5-year plan, if I had stuck to my 5-year plan, I would have missed out on certain deals and opportunities that I had had at my job, right? If I had just like left at like my 5-year mark and just been like, it is 5 years, I need to go to grad school right now. And I think I instead relied on the fact that it felt like the right time. And for me, that meant that the combination of I wasn't learning enough to warrant the amount of time I was investing in my job, and also I wasn't sure that that was the right job. So I think if you start noticing that the job that you're doing isn't stimulating you enough, or if you're looking up or around you at work and you're not excited about what is next. You're not excited about becoming your manager or your manager's manager, or expanding your skill set sideways to like an ancillary job or something that perhaps a peer is doing. Then that's probably a signal that you're ready for change, and you don't need to go to grad school for to like pursue that change, but you might. And then I would say if you're intrigued by something that is completely outside of your wheelhouse, so I know people, for example, who decided that they wanted to become data scientists, right? Like they
Right.
wanted to, and so they pursued degrees to help them make that transition. So if you've discovered through work that there's this role that really excites you and really intrigues you, and you've prototyped it, like you've tried to experiment with it, or you seem interested in it, then pursuing a degree to allow you to make that transition seems like the right time to pursue it. So I don't think there's a right answer to the right time to pursue a degree. I just think it depends on what your goals are, and is a degree the way that will get you there. And grad school is not for everyone, and grad school is not always the right answer. And I think a lot of people think that it is like a natural next step and it's a natural requirement to do things. And there are many
Mhm.
successful people who have never been to grad school. So like I think that's evidence enough that that's not necessarily the case.
So, in case a person is really considering going to um, maybe a master's or an MBA in US.
Mhm.
How big of a role does your financial background play in this? Like, are there any scholarships out there for the MESA region, or is it like something that you really need to save up big for?
Yeah, the financial cost of these programs is like a big problem, and I think it's the biggest stressor. Like immediately once you get into a program, I think the most immediate stress that sets in right after is like, okay, great, how am I going to pay for all of this? I think MBAs specifically are really expensive programs, and some schools. So to my earlier point about like figuring out which schools I wanted to go to, I had actually I had overweighted schools that I knew had need based um, financial aid. So some schools have need based financial aid, which basically means that they look at your financial standing and they offer
Mhm.
you financial aid based on your income, your savings, etc. And so that is super helpful for international students because even if you have so I worked in private equity, which like theoretically is a high paying job, but I was
Yes.
also being paid in Egyptian pounds, which against the US dollar
Mm.
is like nothing, right? And so I couldn't afford a Stanford degree no matter how much I was getting paid. And so I was eligible for financial aid for that reason because the Egyptian pound, because we had just had a revolution, had devalued over 65% against the US dollar. And
Mm.
so one of my biggest criteria was like, I'm not going to go to a school that's not going to give me need based financial aid because I can't afford to pay this much money. Um, and so that's an important thing to be mindful of. Some schools only offer merit based financial aid, which makes it really hard because then you have to compete with other people. And merit is like I said, it's like 400 or 900, depending on the school. Really, really intelligent people. So it's like you are intelligent, but you have to like be top 5% or so to like be eligible for that funding. There are other scholarships. When I was going to school, there weren't a ton available. So there were some. I will say the biggest issue for me was that most scholarships that I found that I was eligible for Egyptian nationals at least, required us to come back to Egypt. And I was explicitly solving for not having to come back. So if you know that you want to return to your home country, um, then there are a decent number of options
Right.
that will fund your program. I will say that I think a lot of them don't pay for MBA programs specifically because they're so expensive. Like they will pay for
Yes.
master's programs, but not MBAs.
Mm.
But again, that clause for me was like a deal breaker clause because I was just like, the whole premise of me going to grad school is that I wanted to explore like alternate industries and alternate roles. And I don't know that those industries and roles exist in Egypt. And so I don't want this thing hanging over my head that I have to come back here.
Yeah.
Um, and so that was another criteria for me. And so I really was like up against a wall. And so I ended up taking debt, which is not something that is easy to like take on. International student debt is really expensive. You don't get the same interest rates that US students get because you're higher risk, right? Like you can theoretically leave the country.
Mm.
And so it's a risk. It's also a risk because you may not get a job in the US after you graduate, which essentially means that if you do return to your country or end up not being employed in the US, you will have US dollar denominated debt and not US dollar denominated income, which is really hard.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
so I am not a financial planner, so you should not take my advice, but I made that choice because again, I am a single person. I don't have family. I don't have children that I have to worry about, paying for their schooling or anything like that. Um, but I cannot explain to you the anxiety. Like when it was time for recruiting, and my classmates were, enjoying their last 2 quarters of our program and like going out and traveling, I was a ball of stress because I was just like, I have this debt and I have to find a job because I have to pay this debt, and it was very
Mm.
stressful. But in the end, like I it was a choice I made. Like, I did not want to be forced to go back. Other people made that choice and they went back and they were just like, I'm not gonna have to stress about finances, and that was my choice. So I think it's what your risk tolerance is.
So I just had a question I forgot. Yeah. So for example, Yasmin, just for my personal information, you when you moved to US, you went on a student visa, right? And then when you get a
Mhm.
job, how does that, like if you had not gotten a job, I'm sorry, and just like considering that, so like it was all that anxiety, right? So how does that debt travel to you all the way to Europe?
So your debt is independent of your visa. Your debt is your debt. It has nothing to do with your visa.
So you they withhold your degree or like
No. Oh, so
how?
your debt, sorry, your debt has nothing to do with your school. Your debt is funded by like private financial institutions that will
Right.
like give you a loan essentially. It's kind of like a bank loan.
Mm-hmm.
Um so like financing institutions offer international students with loans.
Right.
And that is independent of your degree. So you'll graduate and you'll get your degree and you'll be fine, but you'll still owe that money.
I understand. I understand. So sorry. I was just really curious. Like for example, there's some people who just leave the country and they don't think about it. So that is why I was just considering like why do even financial institutions think about this giving out this loan? So like I understand that the tension that you were going through. Like how did Pinterest help you come out of that? Like, what were the skills that you had at that point of time? Did GPA matter at that point of time? Like, how all of those things work out
GPA for recruiting into
for the
Pinterest.
job application? Yep, yep, yep.
Oh, so MBA's GPA doesn't really matter for at least
Hmm.
for most MBA programs. So most MBA programs have something called grade non-disclosure, which
Hmm.
by design, it's like it's intended such that it's like an unofficial agreement such that you don't disclose your grades to employers, and that allows you to enjoy the program and pursue goals other than like high grades in the program, but you're also not supposed to be like failing, so you still have to maintain good academic standing, otherwise you end up being like in probation and all those things. But there isn't like this semblance of I'm like top whatever X percent, or like this was my GPA. So they don't actually give us a GPA. There are people who become like scholars and so on and so forth, so like the top whatever 5%, and those people become eligible for like financial grants from the school, etc. So you could pursue that, and in that case, you can say I was whatever an RJ Miller scholar, or a Siebel scholar, etc. Um, and so some people pursue that so that they can put that money towards their degree. In terms of recruiting, though, at least in my experience, my employer never, or like whenever I was recruiting, I was never asked about my grades. Pinterest never asked me about my grades. My undergrad GPA is like on my resume, but I don't think they care. Um, at least at this point in my career, understanding that like by the time I was recruiting for Pinterest, I had over a decade of work experience.
Yeah.
It's mostly about the work experience, right? And like the skills that you have and what you can do for them. And so the entire interview process centered around the my ability to do this job and how transferable my skills were from previous roles to the role that I was applying for, as opposed to my grades from undergrad.
Understood. Thank you so much for that insight. As like anybody who's a new or newbie would like to know. Yasmin, I have like one really important question. Like you're saying that we need to
Mhm.
apply for financial aids and like we need to have those need-based scholarships. How much does GP at that point of time matter, including your even though you have your work experience, but I think maybe they would want to know like maybe how much of a role does GPA play at that point of time, and like how good of a personal statement do we have to make? What are some do's and don'ts? Maybe if you could guide us about that.
So the beauty of need based is that it is need based. It's not GPA based. Like it literally is. they ask you to fill out forms that like they ask you some really specific questions about how much money you make, what your expenses are, etc., so that they actually try to quantify your need. So that's sort of the beauty of it. Your GPA and your personal statement or your essays, etc., will matter for the application to the school itself, but not for need-based learning. Scholarships outside of financial aid will obviously look at those things. So if you're applying for a scholarship outside of your school itself, they'll ask you for a personal statement. They'll ask you for other things, and mostly. And again, like this is what I did, and not necessarily like the way you should go, but at least this is what I ended up doing, explaining why you're pursuing this degree. And I would say my advice that I give for applying for scholarships, but also applying for schools, is never write down things that you think someone wants to hear about you, because it's actually really easy for people to like read through stuff like that. Just be quite honest with yourself, but also with whoever you're addressing, with what your goals are for this program and this degree you're pursuing, why you think it's important for you to do it, and what this scholarship or this funding will afford you by allowing you to go. And so make it compelling in that regard, and make it personal and about you and about your experience, and why it's important for them to care about you going to this program. And don't make it about like, a list of your resume or your accomplishments and stuff that is like a laundry list that you think they should, or you think that they want to hear, basically.
Yeah. So, like for example, sometimes when we would be getting our prep for writing the personal statements, they do tell us to like write about the motivator, like start off with that particular, like those grabbers, attention grabbers. Does that work, or is that something that you'd like ask us to do, not to do?
I don't know. One thing, so I don't know if you know much about, so Stanford has an essay question that they haven't changed in forever. It's a really famous essay question. And one thing I love about what they say about their essay question is, you will never know whether you got into Stanford because of your essay or in spite of your essay. So I couldn't tell you. Like I wrote an essay and I got in. I have no idea if my essay was good or bad, and I don't know if they read it and they were just like, "Oh, this is amazing, and we should absolutely let her in," or if they read, they're just like, but we should just give her a shot. So I couldn't tell you. I will say, if you are being authentic, like sure, attention grabbers and all this kind of stuff is like a writing like tip or mechanism. I think it depends. I will say, like, if you're applying to a school, at least what I know about admissions at the school I went to is that they do read your essay. I can tell you definitively that they read your essays, because I spoke to people at admissions and they mentioned things in my essay. So I know for a fact that they read my essay and they could still remember things in my essay. So they read it. It's not like they don't skim it. And so I think the like advice that you should put things that are attention grabbing is so that like if someone's skimming your essay or your statement so that they only see the first like one or two sentences or whatever, sure, maybe. But I will say generally it's good advice to think of any writing space as expensive real estate. Don't be, extra verbose for no reason. Don't use complex words and terms for no reason. Be as authentic as possible. I think those are all like good pieces of advice regardless. But honestly, like catchy things or not, or attention grabbing things or not, if you're being honest and like authentic, and like if I'm reading something and I feel like I've learned something about you, then I think you're on the right path, regardless of whether the person's going to skim it or read it in depth.
Thank you so much for guiding us more about the personal statement part. I have like a couple of last questions that are more generic and they're more about some advice or reflection that we can get out of this conversation. So, how do you balance your work and life, your personal life?
Oh, that's pretty hard. I use my dog actually as my boundary setter. So um, I basically over the years developed routines. So I have a very serious morning routine that I do regardless of what my day looks like. And that usually involves walking and feeding my dog, working out, etc., which is why you saw me frazzled earlier before we actually started this call. um, and then I'll start my day. And so I religiously do my morning routine. I never allow anyone to schedule anything on top of it. And I never reschedule it. And so that sort of forces me to maintain that start to my day. And it helps me start my day right. And then my day will look like whatever it will look like. And it can be really high stress or not really high stress or really busy or not really busy. But my dog needs to be walked at 5:30, like on the dot at 5:30. She will come to me and start crying. Like she needs to go outside. And so I take my dog outside at 5:30 and that's like I'm not gonna let her suffer. So I actually use her as like if I'm on a call or if I'm like I have to go walk my dog and if this is really critical, I'll call you back in like 30 minutes or can we pick this up in the morning or something like that. And I'll take a break and I'll go outside and I'll walk my dog for an hour and then I'll come back. And if it's a disaster at work, maybe I'll pick things back up again, like once that's done. More often than not, actually, people figure things out like on their own when you do that. And it has been super rare that I've actually had to come back and like pull up my laptop again and like restart working. Um, and that has been like a game changer for me because I always used to be the person that would never leave the office until like things were done and things were never done, right? And so I was always there until like the late hours of the night. And so I don't like I actually can't believe that I stopped working at 6 p.m. now. Like it kind of blows my mind because anyone that knows me knows that that never used to be my life. Um, but it's been amazing. And then I just don't work weekends, but that's also something that I'm afforded because of the place that I work right now. Like we don't have a culture of working weekends. Um, and so my weekends are completely mine. I don't check my phone. Like I don't check my emails. I mute my notifications on Friday. Like at the end of the day, we work Fridays. So at the end of the day, I like disable my email notifications so that if someone decides that they're going to work on a Friday, which is or on the weekend, then that's their decision. I'm not going to get their emails, or I'm not going to see them until Monday morning. So yeah, I've completely protected my personal time and I've found that it has just made me a slightly less unpleasant person to work with because yeah, I can be intense at work and so if I'm annoyed and intense, like I'm not fun to work with, so it's like it's better.
Thank you for sharing that tip with us. It's especially since the work from home culture is starting more and more to integrate into our homes. I think it has been hard to separate the two. So these are really
Mhm.
good pointers and advices that we can use. Looking back, Yasmin, you started off with different ambitions and you found something that you loved, and then you plateaued over there, and then you grabbed another thing that completely put you out of your comfort zone. What is it that you would have done differently if you could?
Overall,
Overall.
uh I think I would have believed in myself earlier than I did. Like I think I've overall in my career I've played it pretty safe. even transitioning into product, I like didn't really do it. I transitioned into Pinterest within business operations, which like had a very financial aspect of the job. I basically got hired to work on financial planning and on the IPO for the company, which
Mhm.
were similar sort of like required similar skills from the jobs that I've had before. And then I started working with the product team like within that role and exposing myself to that part of our business. Um, and I kept being told by people I worked with, you should become a product manager um, for quite a bit of time. And I think I was just like, no, I'm not an engineer by training. Like, I can't work with engineers. Like, I know numbers. Like, I need to live in Excel. I can't do that job. And I don't think I believed in myself, even though all these people were telling me that I could do that job. Um, and so I think if I could do something differently overall in my life, I think I would like believe in myself earlier than I did and take like bigger chances on myself. Because I think even if they don't work out, like the risk of failure isn't that bad.
So, to end this really nicely, are you happy with where you are today, with all the risks that you took by taking that loan, by getting this job? Was all the anxiety, all the effort worth it?
I mean, I will say I'm very grateful for where I am today. I don't think it's lost on me the privilege of the position that I'm in right now. I am very lucky, both that I was able to secure funding for my program, but also that I managed to navigate U.S. immigration, which is like a whole process that is just excruciatingly painful. Um, and so I'm not going to say it's worth the anxiety. I'm very happy that I am where I am. It's really hard. Like, I'm not going to lie. And I can't even fathom what it's like if you have dependents to go through this process. Um, so it's really hard to say that something is worth this much stress and anxiety. I think it just depends on what you're comparing to or
Hmm.
what you're trying to solve for. I am really happy where I am and I'm very grateful every single day. Like every morning when I walk down the street, I'm just like I'm very thankful that I'm able to be here. And I appreciate some very small things that I don't think I could have if I lived in Egypt right now.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm also conscious that it's not easy for a lot of people. And there was a decent amount of resilience and a decent amount of stress, but also a decent amount of luck that went into it.
That is the best line you've ever you've spoken to sum it all up. That it's all an elixir of all the things. There's not one thing that's gonna pull us through. So Yazin, thank you so much. We've learned so much from you, and the comment section is like all for you to read. It's gonna be on Facebook and LinkedIn both, and we really, really loved having you here. Maybe I can just grab one question from the. Yes, the question is from Catherine. She says, "What matters most to you and why?"
Oh my gosh. Um, so what I wrote in my essay was the most important thing to me in my life is actually helping other people. And I won't walk you through my essay, but making sure that I can help everyone around me, that I can pull people up in similar ways that other people have pulled me up. Um, and to have that have the multiplying effect that it can have is the thing that matters to me most.
I think you've like played a small part, I think a big part for me at least, because I was thinking about getting into a grad school very soon. So you've helped me a lot. So I hope that makes you happy.
I appreciate it. Yeah. Best of luck. I know it's hard.
It is. Thank you so much, Yasmin. Another question that I would like to ask is, you mentioned a teacher of yours who taught you. Could you just like let us know her name?
Oh, the negotiations professor.
Yes, yes.
Her name is Maggie Neal, Maggie, and then her last name is Neal, Neal.
Okay, thank you so much. That wasn't the questions. I didn't want to let them be disappointed that I didn't read it. Thank you. Thank you so much, Yasmin. I hope you get to have another session like this. It was really informative. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Have a good
Okay,
one. Bye.
thank you. Bye bye.